Chapter 1. Little Rock, Arkansas. Zane Steele rubbed his aching thigh as he waited in the hallway for admittance into his packmaster's office. Despite being Barrett Middleton's second in command over the Arkansas Werewolves, Zane still had to wait like every other fucker when he was summoned. Life of being an Arkansas Guardian. Guardians were the elite werewolves who protected the pack in civilian wars from discovery. Although the military knew about werewolves and used them in the armed forces, the rest of the human population had no idea they even existed. It was better for everyone this way. "What's up, man?" Jackson, his fellow guardian, ambled down the hall from the direction of the gym as sweat dripped off his massive body and onto the concrete floor. He was shirtless and his black gym shorts hung low on his hips, revealing a wall of muscle. The Guardian quarters housed not only the packmaster's office but also the Guardian barracks and a state-of-the-art gym where the alphas could release some steam in between missions. "I'm here to see Barrett." He narrowed his eyes at Jackson and wondered why he hadn't scented the word before he'd seen him. His leg wound must be distracting him more than he liked to admit. "When you're done, come out to the gym. I need someone I can spar with that eye. Won't hurt." Jackson grinned over his shoulder as Lucien approached them. "Whatever, fucker. I totally had your ass." Lucien shot Jackson the bird before giving Zayn a "what's up" nod. "If we fought, I'd break you in two, Jackson." Zayn gave his pack brother a rare grin. "Well, we can't all be as badass as you. Some of us have to be charming and damn good looking." Jackson smirked and his blue eyes flashed. "Yeah, that's where I come in." Lucien shoved Jackson hard into the wall. Jackson stumbled but quickly regained his balance and snarled, "Easy, children. I don't have time to break up a fight before my meeting." Zayn disparaged them as his hand brushed his sore thigh. "Always the enforcer." Jackson's gaze dipped to Zayn's thigh. He stopped rubbing his wound when he realized Jackson was staring at him. "Is your leg not healed yet?" Jackson frowned. "Just taking its sweet-ass time. That's all." Zayn shrugged, crossed his arms over his massive chest and tried to ignore the pain. A guardian should be in control of himself at all times, even in control of his pain. He was one of the highest-ranking guardians in Arkansas, and he wasn't about to let a leg injury inflicted from some meth head turn him into a pussy. A few days ago, Zayn had taken Lucien and Jackson on a recon mission to investigate a werewolf who was suspected of making crystal meth. A dilapidated house in rural Arkansas had been the base for the drug operation. Barrett had given Zayn the green light to take down the suspect and destroy the drugs before they could be circulated in the werewolf population. They'd busted into the old house and soon realized that the suspect was not alone. There'd been 15 wolves crammed into the tiny house, and judging from their stench, they were all red wolves. The wolves had drawn on them and, without backup, the guardians were forced to fight for their lives. They'd managed to take out and kill 8 of the wolves immediately upon entry. 5 wers made it out the door, but Jackson and Lucien had quickly caught up to them. They'd shifted and fought, eventually killing all 5. Worse, Zayn had stayed in the house with the other 2 wolves. The wers, sensing they couldn't take him in their human form, both shifted and attacked him. He'd fought them off in his human form before deciding to shift to give himself a better advantage. Right before he shifted, one of the wolves had shoved him backwards into the table where they'd been cooking meth. The cylinder that held the drug had shattered, and a shard of glass had gone into his thigh. The pain only pissed him off further. He dug the glass out of his thigh, then looked up as he gave them a slow, evil grin. Anger pulsed through his body. One werewolf shot out the door and escaped. Zayn launched himself at the other werewolf before he could follow suit. He shoved the shard from his thigh into the drug dealer's neck. Blood spurted out like a fountain. The scent fueled his rage, and he proceeded to rip the red wolf's throat out. That was weeks ago. As a werewolf, he should have healed by now, but his injury was still bothering him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Barrett's door swung open, and the imposing leader stepped out of his office. The guardians all stood a bit straighter as their packmaster, Barrett Middleton, stood in the doorway. Well over 6'5". Barrett looked a bit like the Viking god Thor, with his shoulder-length blonde hair and intense eyes. "What the hell is this? A tampon convention? Don't you all have something to do?" Barrett glared at Jackson and Lucien. "Yes, sir." Jackson fought a grin before he and Lucien strode off in the direction of the barracks, leaving Zayn standing alone. Zayn, come on in. Barrett stepped aside and motioned with a nod to enter. Zayn made his way to the chair in front of Barrett's massive desk. His gaze flitted to the Arkansas Guardian shield that hung on the wall before meeting Barrett's gaze. He waited for his leader to speak. A mission. That's exactly what he needed. Being on a mission always made him feel his best. He needed this to get his mind off his thigh and focus on what was important. His work. He needed something where he could shut down some miscreant werewolves and get to feeling normal, to feel in control. I need you to do something for me. Barrett eased his large, muscled body into the chair behind his desk and slid a brown file over to Zayn. A mission. Zayn frowned as he picked up the file. He wondered why he hadn't heard anything through the grapevine about any upcoming trouble in Arkansas. Usually he had some idea of what was about to go down before it did. He didn't like to be left out of the loop. Not exactly. Barrett rubbed his hand across his face and met Zayn's gaze. I've got to host the Pack Master meeting here in Little Rock. I've got the Pack Masters of Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana coming in, and I can't leave. Sounds like a recipe for a good time. Zayn snorted. Sounds more like a dick measuring contest, Barrett deadpanned. Well, boss, if that's the case, then you don't have any competition. Zayn laughed. Damn right I don't. Barrett reached his arms up and rested them behind his head. So what is it you need me to do? Zayn leaned forward with interest. Politics of the packs always interested him. As a high-ranking guardian, he had ambitions to one day be pack master himself. I've got some new recruits who need their guardian ink. Zayn curled his hands into fists and struggled to keep his expression neutral. His heart rate sped up. You're talking about Braxton and Jaden. He forced the words out of his mouth. Yeah. Barrett lifted his chin. You got a problem with that? No problem. He lied. He had a big fucking problem. Not with Braxton. He liked the tattooed-up werewolf with the blue hair. Braxton had a protective streak continent-wide when it came to women, and Zayn could respect that. Come on, Zayn. I've known you for years. I may be your pack master, but I know you better than anyone else in the Guardians. I know you even better than those two lunkheads, Jackson and Lucien. Barrett glared at him with laser focus. Do you have a problem with your assignment? Like I said, there's no problem. His history with Jaden was nobody's business. Zayn was loyal to Barrett to a fault, but when it came to his family, that was a whole other animal. Where Zayn had grown up with an intact family that had rules and structure, Jaden had been raised by his granny, who didn't exactly follow the rules. He'd realized from his brief interaction with the old lady that she didn't have a filter and didn't know the meaning of discipline. Perfect. Barrett eased back into the chair, resting his elbows on the leather armrests and steepled his fingers. His blonde hair brushed his shoulders as he cocked his head and studied Zayn. The appointment has already been made. Since we've got 2 guardians in each tat is time-consuming, it's going to take a while, so you'll need to leave tonight for Jonesboro. Anyone else going? Zayn remembered getting his guardian tattoo. The tattoo of wings that spanned his back, with eyes that peered out, symbolized you belonged to the Guardians, the elite werewolf soldiers. Being a guardian was a high honor that involves sacrificing yourself for your pack and maintaining control of yourself at all times. It rankled him that Jaden was about to get his ink. Control was not a word he would ever deem fit for Jaden. You can take Lucien. Barrett shrugged. I need Jackson to go check out a situation in the southern part of the state. Sounds good. He stood, and his thigh screamed in protest. He forced his expression to remain neutral under the ache. He had hoped a weekend of rest would facilitate the healing, but that wasn't happening. Maybe a hard ride on his Harley was just the thing to work the soreness out of his thigh and the anger out of his soul. Chapter 2. Skylar Wade stood in the middle of the metal shed and forced back the angry tears threatening to fall. She'd erected the shed in the backyard of the house. She was currently remodeling so she'd have a safe place to lock up her tools. At the end of each workday, she fingered the lock that had been cut away with bolt cutters and swallowed a growl. She'd had the shed delivered and set up when she started working on the house to keep drug addicts from stealing her tools at night. There'd been a recent string of robberies at construction sites, so she'd taken precautions. Or so she'd thought. In the end, even the lock hadn't deterred the thieves. They were like rats determined to get into a refrigerator filled with cheese. Assholes. She slammed the door of the shed. The metal clanged loudly along, with the beat of her heart echoing in her ears. She was on deadline to get this house finished, and now because some of her tools were gone, she was going to fall behind. She was counting on the money from this job so she could place a bid on the old abandoned apartment building on the south side of town. Her vision of remodeling the apartments as a home for runaway girls who needed a safe place had been her mission in life. Having grown up neglected, where she'd been raised by an abusive father, Skylar wanted to give girls a different life. She wanted to give them a different childhood. In giving back, maybe she could set her ghosts to rest and finally have some peace. She pulled out her cell phone and pulled up her list of workers. She needed to let them know that there was going to be a late start to the work day. No need to tell them about the break-in. It would only worry them, and they might start looking for work somewhere else. She glanced at the time on her phone. She had just enough time to replace her tools before the workers got there. And this time she was adding a heavy chain and lock to her list of supplies. Chapter 3. I packed some cookies. Granny, in her orange and pink muumuu, ambled over to the group of bikers and proceeded to hand out brown paper sacks to each of the guardians. Zayn frowned but didn't make eye contact. He figured it was best not to encourage the old woman. Granny, it's not a picnic. Jaden grimaced as his grandmother handed him a bag and patted his cheek. But these are your favorites. Snickerdoodles. Granny pursed her lips together. Thanks, Granny. Jaden smiled and unrolled the top of the bag to peer inside. Zayn clenched his teeth. Just being around the ass-kisser Jaden made him want to pummel him in the face. If they didn't leave soon, he was going to do just that. Granny stopped in front of him and held out a bag. He grunted but didn't take the bag. Come on, son. You need to keep up your energy. Granny smiled. Thanks, but I'm good, Zayn insisted. He was acquainted with Jaden's sex. Toy-selling Granny. What the hell did she think this was? Going off today? Camp? There was no love lost between him and Jaden Parker. Zayn had caught the whir. With his sister Katie doing the nasty. He'd come over to check on Katie only to find Jaden buck-ass naked and in her bed. Before he could get his hands on the asshole, Jaden had jumped out the window without his clothes. Are you diabetic? Gluten intolerant? Have an allergy? Granny cocked her head and tapped a finger to her lips as she tried to diagnose him. Braxton and Lucien snorted behind him. He turned and shot them the bird over his shoulder before turning his attention back to the elderly woman. I'm not diabetic, gluten intolerant, or allergic. I just don't want any. He snarled. Granny, give them to me, Jaden called out after he straddled his Harley Davidson breakout. He smiled as Granny passed him a second bag. Zayn slid onto his red breakout and tried to think of anything other than kicking Jaden's smug ass. When are you coming home? Granny asked. I don't know. Hopefully in a couple of days. Check on Haley for me, will ya? Jaden said. Of course. We've got a lot to do to get ready for this wedding. Granny waggled her gray eyebrows. I know just what kind of present to give you for the honeymoon. I got a new shipment of edible. Enough, Zayn called out. He didn't need whatever was about to pass through the old lady's lips to stick in his head for the duration of the trip. Let's ride. He started his engine and the bike rumbled to life. The street came alive with the roar of Harleys. Zayn looked at Lucien before pulling out and down the street. He glanced in his rearview mirror as the other two Harleys peeled out and followed behind him in formation. He loved his Harley like he loved his brothers, except for one. He narrowed his eyes on the newest member to their group, Jaden. He'd never had a problem with another guardian before. Not until Jaden. It was causing him to seriously rethink the qualifications for being a guardian, something he would have to take up with Barrett. Chapter 4. Zayn lowered his speed as they entered the city limits of Jonesboro, Arkansas. His headlight cast a streak of white against the black asphalt. The sun had long since dropped behind the horizon, cooling things off to a manageable temperature. Despite it being July in the south, the city had grown since the last time he'd been here, and he was surprised at how spread out it was quickly becoming. They would definitely need to place guardians in this area soon. He turned onto Main Street and drove to the end of the street before making a left. He ignored the people on the sidewalk who stopped to gawk at the group of bikers entering their town. They probably thought they were up to no good. Too bad they didn't know the truth. Guardians were the only thing keeping the human population safe from rogue werewolves who wouldn't think twice about killing for shits and giggles. Zayn slowed his speed as the Moon Goddess tattoo shop came into view. He pulled into the parking space in front of the shop. The rest followed suit and parked behind him. He put the kickstand down and dismounted his Harley. Lucien peeled off his fingerless motorcycle gloves and shoved them in the pocket of his leather jacket. The were rolled his leather and steel stud-clad shoulders as he cast his gaze across his surroundings. His jet-black hair was windblown and he didn't bother smoothing it out. His piercing green gaze was hidden behind sunglasses that he really didn't need, but that didn't impede his keen eyesight. Lucien had taken to wearing his Oakleys all the time after he'd met Damon Trahan, who never took his off. Afraid you're gonna get a callus? Zayn snorted. He and Jackson constantly rode their fellow guardian about wearing gloves. Lucien had no qualms about dressing the part of a biker. And judging from the looks the humans on the sidewalk were shooting their way, the humans believed the whole gang to be dangerous. They weren't wrong. The owner of the Moon Goddess tattoo shop, Matt Townsend, ambled out of the shop. He had sleeve tattoos on both arms and tattoos circling his neck. Zayn bet the guy had his entire body tattooed, but he couldn't confirm what hid underneath the jeans and t-shirt. Zayn, good to see you, bro. Matt was the official tattoo artist for the Guardians in Arkansas. The job of marking the specialized soldiers had been handed down to him from his father, who had inherited it from his own father. The artist was always a civilian werewolf, and they were well compensated. Every state had its own tattoo artist. Before they had started tattooing the backs of guardians, they had used other ways to mark their soldiers, less pleasant ways like branding the flesh. Nowadays it was all about the ink. Hello, Matt. Zayn gripped Matt's shoulder in a half hug as he slapped the civilian wear on the back. I see you were waiting for us. Actually, I was about to take a smoke break. Matt grinned sheepishly. Disgusting habit. You need to give it up. Lucien smirked as he greeted the tattoo artist with a hug. You're right, Lucien, but I need a little excitement in my life. I don't get to go around shooting shit up and ripping out throats like you guys do. Matt chuckled as he lit up. A thin wisp of gray smoke trailed up to the inky sky and was quickly eaten up by the darkness. Matt inhaled again before he blew out a stream of gray and nodded at Jaden and Braxton. They the new brothers? So it would seem, Zayn muttered. If he had any say in the matter, he would have voted Jaden's ass out the minute the fucker walked across the Arkansas state line. But it wasn't up to him. It was up to Barrett, who became a guardian and who got cut. That was the one thing Zayn couldn't stand. Having a voice when it came to choosing his brothers. If he was going to lay down his life for someone, it better fucking well be someone he gave two shits about. And Zayn didn't give a shit about Jaden. Matt stuck out his hand and Braxton shook it. I'm Braxton Devereaux. Nice to meet you. Matt Townsend. I hear you are up in the Eureka Springs area. I'd love to take my old lady up there for a weekend. You should. My mate Kate runs a kick-ass bed and breakfast called the Bella Luna. You want to get your woman all hot and bothered? Then that's the place to be. Braxton grinned. Sounds perfect. Matt smiled back. I'll check it out online tonight. Thanks for the info. Matt turned his attention to Jaden. Jaden. Nice to meet you, Matt. Jaden shook Matt's hand. I appreciate you getting us in this late. I know you'd rather be spending tonight with your mate. Irritation flared in Zayn's stomach like a stick of dynamite. Why the fuck was Jaden rolling in and acting like he was the one in charge? What he would rather be doing is working instead of listening to you wasting his time, Zayn snarled. Jaden straightened and turned to face Zayn. Just saying hello. Didn't know I was wasting his time. You know, that's the thing about you, Jaden. It's always about you and what you want. Zayn curled his fingers into fists as anger boiled into every recess of his cells. His heart rate jumped into overdrive as his breathing quickly turned into a heated pant. Everything in his body screamed for him to shift. Look, man, I suggest you turn down your arrogance a notch or two. I do not like what you're giving me. Jaden bowed up and took a step toward him. Rage filtered through every cell of his body as bloodlust sucked him under like an ocean wave. The only thing he wanted was to rip Jaden's throat out. Dude, your eyes, Lucien warned. Zayn didn't need the warning. He already knew his eyes were turning yellow, signaling his impending shift into wolf. Dial it back, Zayn. Lucien placed his hand on Zayn's shoulder. Zayn stiffened for a brief second before knocking Lucien's hand off. Don't fucking touch me, he growled. He sucked in shallow breaths as his heart drummed in his chest, ready to explode. Look man, what's your fucking problem? You've had an issue with me ever since I joined the Guardians. Jaden narrowed his eyes and took another step closer. You're all about the Guardians being brothers, but you sure as shit aren't living it. Rage exploded within Zayn as he lunged for Jaden. He caught the whir around the neck with one hand and knocked him to the ground. Jaden swung and hit him in the face. The taste of blood filled his mouth, feeding his anger. The sound of ripping clothes turned to white noise in his ears, but Zayn couldn't stop. What was coming next? He knew he was shifting right there in front of God and everyone. He couldn't stop it. Fuck. Lucien put all his massive body weight behind the shove that sent him and Zayn tumbling into the dark alley between the tattoo shop and a consignment shop. They landed with a thud on the concrete. The jolt rattled Zayn's teeth. What the fuck is going on? Lucien demanded near Zayn's ear. Zayn had shifted and was now in wolf form while Lucien sat on top of him. You can't fucking shift in public, bro. If Barrett finds out, he can have you kicked out of the Guardians. Or worse. Zayn struggled to get his urge to maim and kill under control. He caught a glimpse of Jaden walking into the alley, and he let out a warning growl. What's going on? Jaden asked. Just stay back, Lucien warned. Go inside with Matt and get started on the tattoo. We'll be in a minute. Jaden nodded before disappearing inside with Matt. When Zayn heard the door close, he twisted his body in one fluid movement and bucked Lucien off. He leapt to his feet and snarled at the Guardian. Lucien glanced down at his leather jacket. Fuck. You made me scuff up my jacket, dick. He glared at Zayn. What the fuck is wrong with you? You know, you can't be shifting in public like that. And why the fuck aren't you shifting back? Zayn lifted his head to Lucien. Rage filled his veins and the urge to rip Lucien's throat out swamped him like an ocean wave. What the fuck was wrong with him? Why couldn't he shift? And why the fuck did he want to hurt Lucien? Zayn sprang to his feet and stared at Lucien through wolf eyes. He nodded in the direction of the shop, hoping his friend would get the hint and leave. Something's been going on with you for a while. Lucien cocked his head. No, you've not been yourself since we went on that last mission. Did something happen? Holy fuck. The drug takedown. Getting stabbed in the thigh. The wound not healing. Lucien was right. Ever since that night, Zayn had been on edge, ready to fight. He tried to cover it the best he could by pushing his body to the limit during workouts and training exercises, but even after that, he craved the taste of blood. Barrett would kill him if it turned out that it was impossible for him to shift back, or worse, kick him out of the Guardians. He'd rather face death than lose his job. His job was his purpose, his life. He gritted his teeth and nodded toward the door. Fine, man. I get it. You don't want to talk about it. Lucien held out his hands. I'll go keep an eye on those two while you pull it together. I'll bring you some clothes when I come back. Lucien stormed down the alley back to the entrance of the tattoo shop. Zayn kept his gaze trained on him until Lucien disappeared from view. Chapter 5. Skylar had managed to play off the late start to the workday as the she-truck not being dropped off on time. Thank God the guys believed her. Her guys were hard workers and she didn't want to lose them to another contractor. They'd managed to put in half a day's worth of work under the grueling Arkansas sun before they began to lose days. Chapter 6. She looked around at her ragtag construction crew, and a smile grew on her lips. They might not look like much, but they were the closest thing she had to a family. Miss Skylar, what are your plans for tonight? Tony gave her a shy smile. The sweat on his olive skin gave off an iridescent sheen. The young man had just moved to Jonesboro from Mexico to live with extended family. His goal was to earn enough money to one day go to college. I think I have date. She arched her brow as she dusted off her jeans. His smile slipped and he glanced down at the ground. She inhaled a sharp breath, realizing he'd mistaken her words. I have a date with a bubble bath and a beer, she assured him. Tony brightened and he quickened his pace as he began loading the tools back into the shed. He's got a crush, Skylar. Hector elbowed her in the ribs. Hector, he's just a kid. He's only a few years younger than you. Plus, he's legal. Hector's bushy brows shot up. In age and immigration. It didn't matter what his age was, she wasn't interested in dating. She had too much stuff on her plate as it was. A guy would just add to her to-do list. She'd been lucky to land this contracting job. She'd not met the owner of the house in person, she'd put her bid in online, and follow-up communication had been via phone or email, since the owner lived out of town. She wondered if the reason she was picked for the job was because the owner was a female and had been willing to give her a shot. It didn't matter, she needed this job. She was going to make a nice profit once it was finished, and unlike past jobs, the owner didn't bother her much. Apparently, the owner lived in Little Rock with her husband and wanted to fix up her house so she could sell it. With the new hospital that had just been built, housing prices in Jonesboro were skyrocketing. She remembered first looking at the old farmhouse set on the outskirts of town. There had been some kind of explosion that had destroyed part of the building. The kitchen and the back had suffered the most damage. Fixing it up was an undertaking for sure. The house was probably 50 years old, and the electrical and plumbing had to be redone to bring it up to current code before remodeling could begin. Now, 2 months into her project and on schedule, it was starting to take shape. Her heart leapt in her chest as she thought about her next project. The apartment building. Once this job was finished and she had her tidy profit, she was going to move on to what she really wanted to do. Make a difference for girls in trouble. She'd often wondered if her life would have turned out any different if she'd had a safe place to stay, instead of being forced to survive in the hell her father had raised her in. As a child, she'd suffered enough from neglect. Dirty clothes, not enough food, and no heat in the trailer in winter. But once she'd entered puberty, things had gotten worse. Her father had turned a blind eye when his perverted friends had taken an interest in her. Her only moments of escape were the time she spent at her friend Katie's house. But even then, she couldn't completely escape hell. Those dark nights in Katie's parents' home, she'd lain awake worrying about Dawn. She knew once the sun came up she was going to have to leave her safe haven and go back to the hell known as her father's trailer. If she could save just one girl, then her life wouldn't be a total waste. She jumped when her phone buzzed in her jeans pocket. Pulling it out, she headed over to her truck to have a little privacy away from her construction crew. Hello. Her heart slid into her stomach as the voice of the owner of the house began telling her that she was moving up the deadline for the finished remodel. Her mind raced as her mouth went dry. How could she have this finished in time? She was pushing her workers as it was. Not to mention the break-in. If her tools were stolen one more time, then there would be no way she'd make the deadline for finishing the house. I see. She tried to swallow around the lump that had developed in her throat. She opened her mouth to tell the owner that she couldn't make that deadline, that it was impossible, but the words froze in her throat. The conversation ended, and she stood there with the phone pressed against her sweaty face. Chapter 7. Zane's heart pounded in his chest as he concentrated on shifting back to human form. Nothing. This wasn't good. Not at all. If he couldn't control his shift, he was shit out of luck. He padded down to the end of the empty alley. A chain-link fence was the only thing between him and the street. Remembering the drive into town, he knew that after passing through the neighborhood, it was only a mile or so before a flat field of rice appeared. It didn't provide much cover for a wolf his size, but it would be away from the human population. Maybe he could find an old building to take cover in until he could shift back. He glanced over his shoulder. He couldn't wait on Lucien to bring him clothes. If Lucien came out and saw that he still hadn't shifted back into human form, then he'd know something was badly wrong, and it would be Lucien's duty to inform Barrett. Fuck the clothes. Zane backed up a few feet and took off at a dead run. He leapt into the air and cleared the top of the fence. He landed on his feet on the cool concrete. On the other side, he crouched, listening for footsteps. Nothing. Shoving off, he ran for the cover of a copse of trees between two houses. Traffic was minimal. The only people out and about were those coming home from a late day at the office. His ears perked up as the sounds of voices and laughter and the sizzle from meat being cooked on an outdoor grill drifted around him. After making sure the coast was clear, he sprinted for the next house. He repeated this, making sure to stay within the protection of the shadows. Headlights of an approaching car had him ducking behind some shrubbery in front of a window. "Mommy, there's a monster outside my window." A tiny child's voice reached Zane's ears. "Shit." He raced for the next house and took cover behind a large prickly bush to see if anyone would come outside to investigate the child's claims. As soon as he was out of danger from discovery, he sprinted for the next house. His heart raced as he spied the isolated industrial part of town a short distance from the last house in the neighborhood. If he could make it down there without being noticed, just on the other side lay the flat rice fields that stretched on forever. Seeing his chance, he sprinted toward freedom. His lungs ached as he pushed, his animal body running harder and faster than ever before. His paws bounded across the hard pavement with each swift step. By the time he reached the first row of rice fields, his heart was about to beat out of his chest. Crouching among the green stalks, he peered around, looking and listening for any signs of a presence, human or animal. Nothing. His eyes quickly adjusted to the darkness. He slowly stood, lifted his face to the wind and inhaled deeply. He caught a faint scent of crops and dirt. Odd. Usually he would be overwhelmed by the scents of the night, but not tonight. He listened carefully. Other than the occasional field mouse he could hear scurrying among the rows, he was completely alone. He needed to find shelter soon before he shifted again. It was one thing to see a large wolf, but a naked man would stir up more news coverage than Bigfoot if someone saw him, especially in a city as small as Jonesboro. He sprinted across the rows, heading as far away from the city as he could. He caught a glimpse of a small building off in the distance. He changed direction and raced for the target. As he drew near, he discovered that the building was a shed of some kind off to the side of a house. He padded over to the abandoned house and sniffed. He smelled nothing. He walked up the narrow steps. The front porch had just been added, as evidenced by new boards under his feet. The windows were boarded up, and the front door was locked. He walked down the steps and headed around the back of the house. There was a tiny back porch that seemed dated. This wasn't a newly built house. It was a remodel. He walked up the back steps and tried to nose his way in the back door. Locked. Giving up, he headed toward the shed. The door had a heavy chain around the handles to prevent anyone from entering. Whoever had done that was probably worried about someone stealing their lawnmower. His heart picked up speed as his thigh ached like fire racing across his flesh. Picking up the chain between his teeth, he tugged hard. The chain snapped. Nosing open the door, Zayn headed inside the safety of the shed. Once inside, he pulled the door closed with his teeth. It wasn't locked, but he could probably hear someone if they approached, and would have time to escape before being discovered. Standing on trembling legs, he looked around at the power tools littering the small building. He nudged some tools aside with his head so he could at least have a space to lie down to recover. Walking around in a circle, he lay down and curled his body into a ball. Pain raced through his body, replacing the urge to fight. Whatever had caused him to shift was now trying to make him shift back into human form. And if he couldn't control it, then he was fucked. Chapter 8. Skylar arrived early at her construction site. She knew her crew wouldn't be here for another couple of hours. She'd had a bad dream and hadn't been able to get back to sleep, so she decided to start her day early. Her gaze narrowed on the shed and the broken chain that was currently lying on the ground like discarded trash. Son of a bitch. She slammed the truck into park and killed the engine. She grabbed her 9mm out of the glove compartment before sliding out of the truck. Druggy asshole better not have stolen my tools. She stomped toward the shed. As she clutched the gun in both hands, she was sick and tired of this. She raised the handgun and aimed it as she reached for the door. She doubted very seriously that the thief was still inside. He would be long gone by now, along with her expensive tools. But Skylar knew she should never assume anything. She'd learned that much growing up among thieves and drug dealers. She grabbed the door handle and pulled. The door swung open and bright morning sunlight washed the interior of the small shed. Tools hung along the wall, and the table saw was where she'd left it. Everything seemed to be where she'd left it. Her heart jumped in her throat as she spotted a large naked man curled up in the corner. He was lying on his side, giving her a view of his muscular back. A large, menacing black tattoo of razor-sharp wings with a pair of eyes peering out spanned his entire back. Shit! She gripped the gun in both hands. So the crackhead had gotten high and passed out before he could steal anything. Now it was up to her to handle him. She reached for her cell phone in her jeans pocket as the naked man began to stir. Don't even think about moving, asshole. She glanced down at her phone and managed to punch in a 9. The cops are going to take your naked ass to jail. Too bad, 'cause he had a nice ass. The man tensed and then leapt to his feet in one swift movement. He turned and faced her. Her mouth dropped open. He wasn't your typical drug user. No, this guy wasn't skinny, far from it. He was broad, with muscles that spanned his broad chest and six-pack abs. His muscular thighs tensed and moved with each breath, and she felt the hair on her neck stand at attention. Her gaze dropped lower. He was huge. Everywhere. Her face heated as she dragged her gaze up from his nice package to his face. She shook her head as she tried to focus on his features in case he made a break for it and she had to identify him to the cops. His dark hair was short and neat and framed his stunning face. He glared at her with light blue eyes that seemed oddly familiar, and she didn't think she'd ever seen a more handsome yet dangerous-looking man. He probably made women fall at his feet for 1 minute alone with him, despite the fact he looked more than ready to end your life. She lifted her face and inhaled as his familiar scent drifted to her. You're not human. She cocked her head as she kept her gun trained on him. Surprise flickered through his eyes, followed by confusion. What did you say? He frowned at her as his nostrils flared. You heard me, Wolf. She ended the phone call before it went through and shoved her phone into her pocket. How do you know that? He glanced around as his fingers curled into fists at his side. His gaze darted from her to the door, as if he was contemplating whether he could make it past her before she got off a shot. I know because I'm a wolf too. The color drained from his face as he met her gaze. His breathing increased, and he looked at the floor. He shook his head and murmured, That's impossible. Why? Because you don't think I'm pretty enough to be a wolf. She gritted her teeth. She'd spent her life growing up being criticized because of her red hair and her stick-thin figure. It wasn't until she'd hit puberty and gotten her curves that the men who hung around her dad had started looking at her differently. Being a female wolf was nothing but a curse. Those old insecurities rose up in her head as she stared back at the dangerous wolf. He had her heart tripping in her chest at how attractive he was. But his dismissive words had turned her blood cold and brought up a past that she'd hidden away. That's not it. Then what is it? Her eyes narrowed. She wanted nothing more than for him to hit the road. He met her gaze. Fear crossed his expression, and her heart tugged in her chest. His eyes widened as he took a step closer. If you're a wolf, then why can't I smell it? Chapter 9. Zane stared at the beautiful woman in front of him. Something about her was vaguely familiar. If what she was saying was true and she was in fact a wolf, then he was beyond fucked. What did you say? She frowned as she lowered the gun she'd aimed at him, since she'd burst through the door. I can't smell your scent. He gritted his teeth until his jaw ached. He glanced down at the injury on his thigh. In addition to losing control of his shift, now he'd lost his sense of smell. Basically, he was blind. That doesn't make sense. She eyed him warily. All wolves can smell other wolves. Yeah, well, apparently my sniffer is on the fucking blink. Along with other things. The floodgates of anger spilled into his veins like a slow-rising river ready to flood the valley. How'd you do that? She eyed him. Do what? He slammed his eyes shut and tried to control his anger. The overwhelming urge to shift was bearing down on him, and he knew if he didn't get her out of here, he might hurt the pretty little wolf. How'd you break your nose? She cocked her head and crossed her arms over her full breasts. His eyes popped open. She was making fun of him. A laugh rolled out of him before he could stop it. If I knew, then I would know how to fix it, wouldn't I? So how did you end up in my shed? She glanced around the room taking inventory. I didn't steal anything if that's what you're worried about. Her gaze landed between his legs, and her face turned a pretty shade of red. Although I wouldn't hesitate stealing some clothes right now. He shot her a grin as she lifted her gaze to his. So you shifted without having an extra set of clothes. That's not very Smart. She looked up to the ceiling. I was kind of in a tough spot. Oh yeah? Like you got some bad drugs or something? That kind of tight spot. It was obvious from the look she was shooting him that she didn't trust him. Smart girl. I don't do drugs. Drugs did him. Or whatever the hell that was in his system. That was trying to fuck him up. So why are you in my shed? Her eyes darted down to his erection and then, back up. He contemplated how much to tell her. So he went for the half-truth. I was infiltrating a drug deal by some rogue wolves. Shit went south. Shifted and went after the dealer. Suspect got away and I was caught without access to my clothes. I saw your building and thought I could hide out until I figured out how to get some more clothes. So the tattoo on your back. It means I'm a guardian. He finished the sentence for her. I've never met one before. I figured you guys were a myth. She gave him a suspicious look. We are only around when there's trouble. I doubt you had any kind of trouble when you were growing up. He snorted and looked around for an old rag or something to at least cover his dick with. Right. She narrowed her gaze. Or maybe guardians wouldn't even come to the places I grew up in. He jerked his head back to her and studied her face. Her straight red hair hung past her shoulders, and he wondered if she smelled like strawberries. She had bright blue eyes the color of a summer sky, and perfect pink lips. Despite the growing heat of the day, she wore jeans that hugged her curves and a sleeveless white shirt that showed off the muscles in her arms. She had an old baseball cap pulled down on her head, and from the looks of the paint stains on her clothes, she was the one who'd been doing work on the house. And even though he couldn't smell her scent, he was inexplicably drawn to her. He took a step closer, expecting her to step back. She held her ground in his gaze. How about you go see if you can fetch me up some clothes? He stared down into her face. Fuck if he couldn't get lost in those eyes of hers. She smiled and placed her palm in the middle of his naked chest. His dick ached and swelled from the innocent touch. How about you fetch them up yourself? I'm nobody's bitch. She turned on her heel and marched out into the yard. Zayn watched her disappear into the house and scratched his chest. Usually, women would do anything he asked. Not her. No, this female was different. He glanced down at his erection and groaned. Not only was he fucked, things looked like he wasn't going to get fucked either. Chapter 10. Where the hell is Zayn? Barrett growled. Lucien grimaced and held the phone away from his ear. He hated lying and he avoided it at all costs, especially when it came to Barrett. He knew his pack master could make his life a living hell if he so chose. He also knew Zayn. And what had happened last night wasn't like his fellow guardian. He's still at the tattoo shop. Lucien flinched at the lie. Well, Zayn's Harley was still at the tattoo shop. That much was true. As far as where the fuck Zayn had gone after Lucien had gone inside last night, he didn't have a fucking clue. How did the tats go? Anyone cry like a bitch? Barrett asked. Not that they would ever admit, but I think Jaden got glassy-eyed once or twice when they were working across his spine. Yeah, that always smarts a little, Barrett said. Lucien relaxed a little. As long as Barrett didn't ask about Zayn again. Tell Zayn to answer his fucking phone. I need to talk to him. Will do. Boss. Lucien ended the call and shoved the cell phone back into the pocket of his leather jacket. He glanced around the street before entering the alley by the shop. Why would Zayn leave without telling him where he was going? And why the hell would he leave when he had no clothes to change into? He frowned as the faint coppery scent of blood drew his attention to the ground. He crouched and ran his hand across the dark spot on the concrete. Zayn's blood. He'd noticed the blood around Zayn's mouth after Jaden had punched him. He stared at the smear of red on his fingers before swiping them across a patch of green grass that had stubbornly pushed through a crack in the concrete. The question was what was going on in Zayn's head. He'd never seen the get so heated so quick before. He knew there was some history between Zayn and Jaden when it came to Zayn's sister Katie, but from what he could tell, that shit had happened years ago. Jaden was mated, and was even getting married to Haley. There had to be something else going on with his partner. He pulled out his phone and glanced around, making sure he was alone. He'd left Jaden and Braxton inside to get their tats. When they'd asked about Zayn, he'd covered and said that Zayn had been called away for some mission from Barrett. He punched in some numbers on his cell and waited for the call to connect. Jackson, we've got a Chapter 11. Skylar stormed into the house, putting some much-needed distance between herself and that gorgeous werewolf who had her body overheating like an air conditioner in the middle of an Arkansas summer. He hadn't recognized her. After all these years, he hadn't recognized her yet. She hadn't forgotten him. Story of her life. The arrogant asshole had another thing coming if he thought she was going to do his bidding. Her father had tried to control her, and she wasn't going to let another man or wolf try to do the same. She stomped through the house and set the gun down on the board that was lying across what would soon be the kitchen island. The smell of wood shavings and paint had always calmed her down before. Maybe it was the possibility of creating something new and starting over. Right now the scent wasn't working. What the hell was Zayn doing here anyway? It unnerved her that a guardian was poking around her construction site. She didn't need him around bringing up her past. She was in a different place in her life now. She was productive and happy in meeting her goals. Bringing up stuff from the past was only going to hinder her future. She fished her cell out of her back pocket and pulled up the phone option. Her finger hovered over the number pad as she contemplated her choices. If she called the cops, then he would probably make trouble for her since he was one of the well-connected guardians of Arkansas. She could call the Packmaster of Arkansas and lodge a complaint about finding one of his guardians naked. She seriously doubted he would even listen to her. And she certainly didn't want to make trouble with the pack. She didn't need that. She just wanted to be left alone to build her business and make the town a good place to live. She sighed and shook her head. I guess it's up to me to handle him. The thought made her stomach churn. She pulled out her phone and dialed Hector. She quickly told him to call her workers and tell them they were getting a late start on the day again due to materials not being delivered. Maybe if she was lucky, she could find Zayn some clothes and he'd leave. Skylar had never been lucky in her life, so maybe it was time for her luck to change. Chapter 12. Zayn found a drop cloth with paint stains crumpled up under some buckets in the corner of the shed. After shaking it out, he wrapped the material around his waist and headed after her. He didn't need that woman calling the cops or, worse, his packmaster. He needed to find that drug dealer who had been in the meth house that night. He needed to know what exactly he'd been infected with so he could find a cure. He hurried across the yard as the early morning sun peeked over the horizon. It wasn't even full daylight and the air was already stifling. It was going to be another hot July day. He walked around to the back door and noticed the door was ajar. He made it up the steps and into the kitchen and froze. What are you doing? He kept his voice low as he studied the cell phone in her hand. Well, I was going to call the cops to get you off my property, but I figured if I could find you some clothes, then maybe you would leave on your own. She lifted her chin. Clothes would get you one step closer to getting rid of me. Promise. Her sapphire blue eyes narrowed. It was clear she didn't believe a word he was saying. I swear it. Fine. Stay here while I run to the consignment shop. Consignment shop? He hadn't intended for her to buy him clothes. He'd figured she could borrow them from a friend or relative. Yeah, consignment shop. She propped her hands on her hips and scowled. Look, I know you guardians are used to wearing high-end jeans with all that money you make, but I can't afford designer jeans. She turned on her heel and headed for the door. She stopped at the door and shot him a glare over her shoulder, holding up her finger in warning. And don't touch anything while I'm gone. He stood in stony silence after she slammed the door behind her. Never in his life had anyone talked to him that way, especially a female. Well, there was this one female, but that had been a very long time ago, and she had been just a child and full of spunk. That child had the same flaming red hair and startling sapphire blue eyes as this woman. His breathing hitched as déjà vu settled over him. He might have lost his sense of smell, but his sixth sense was screaming at him that this was the same person. After all these years he'd found that little girl and now she was all grown. Chapter 13. Skylar plunked down some bills as the old man at the cash register bagged up her purchase. She'd managed to find some jeans and a t-shirt that would fit the werewolf. She'd even found some second-hand boots that she hoped would fit. She'd not really looked too hard at his feet when he had been standing in front of her naked. But if the size of his boot correlated to the size of his package, then the large boots would fit. Thanks. She snagged the bag off the counter and headed out the door. She walked past the tattoo shop and glanced down at her phone to check the time. She'd wasted enough hours today taking care of some guardian werewolf who probably wouldn't even lift a finger to help her if she needed it. Distracted by her cell phone, she slammed into a wall of muscle. She stumbled back and caught her balance before she fell. Sorry. She glanced up and gave the stranger an apologetic smile. She froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Skylar Wade. Long time no see. The large were grinned as his vulgar gaze roamed up and down the length of her body. Herschel. She clutched her phone in her hand like a weapon and forced herself not to look away. Herschel Baker had been one of her father's loser friends. He was always hanging around when she was growing up. Every time she saw him, he was either drunk or high. He'd always given her the creeps, and she'd learned to keep her distance from the were. I didn't know you were back in Arkansas. I thought you were still living in Louisiana. His grin stretched wider, revealing yellowed teeth and a pockmarked face. Just here on business. It was a total and complete lie. She'd moved to Louisiana to get away from her father and his nasty drug trade. It wasn't until after he'd died in a drug deal gone wrong that she'd moved back home. She hadn't even bothered going to the funeral. When she'd heard about his death, she'd been relieved. It was one less drug dealer in the world. She didn't want to be reminded of any ties to her past. She wanted to concentrate on her future. That was why she was back in Jonesboro. She'd taken her skill for building stuff and her love of drawing and developed her own construction company. She'd built a few houses from the ground up and had done quite well. You're looking good, Skylar. He leaned in close and sniffed. Not a little girl anymore, I see. His lips curved up over his tobacco-stained teeth. I see you haven't changed one bit. She took a step back and wrinkled her nose at his scent. Male red wolves carried a musky scent that turned her stomach. Her breathing increased as panic began to settle in her chest. It's been too long. We need to get together, get reacquainted. His grin grew to a menacing promise of evil. No, we don't. She stuck her hand in her jeans pocket and gripped her keys. She regretted leaving her gun in the truck, but she hadn't expected trouble at the consignment store in the middle of the day. Herschel's grin faded as his gaze zeroed in on the large boots sticking out of her plastic bag. You made it. He narrowed his eyes on her. Yes, I am. The lie came easily enough, and for a brief second she wondered what it would be like to be bound forever to a werewolf like Zayn. What would life be like being cared for and protected by a guardian? The whole thing of being protected and loved was such a foreign concept to her. Her own mother had died giving birth to Skylar, and she knew her father had always resented her for it. Maybe that was why he'd neglected her when she was growing up. Maybe that was why he'd turned to drugs to smother the pain of living without a mate. It really didn't matter. In the end, she couldn't make excuses anymore for someone else's choice. Who's the lucky guy? Herschel looked around nervously, as if he expected her mate to appear out of nowhere and demand to know what the hell he was doing. Talking to her. A smile grew on her lips as she imagined Zayn smashing his fist into Herschel's face right here in public. Nobody, you know. I met him in Louisiana. Herschel held her gaze as silence stretched between them. I guess he must not be doing too well if you're having to buy clothes from the second-hand store. Herschel whipped out his wallet and tugged out several $100 bills and waved them under her nose. I've got more to offer a female than he does. You should really think about that, Skylar. He shoved the money in the wallet and put it back in his jeans pocket. No thanks, she muttered to herself. She'd walk barris naked down Main Street before taking one dime from him. Clearing her throat, she straightened her shoulders. I've got to go. He's waiting to have lunch with me. She moved past him as she clutched the bag of clothes to her chest. She didn't have to turn around to know that he was watching her walk away. She could feel the heat of his eyes on her. It made her stomach turn. When she reached the safety of her truck, she slid inside and locked the doors. She looked around, searching to see if he was still there. She didn't want him following her back to the house. Not that it would matter much. He would probably hightail it out of there once he laid eyes on Zayn. She scanned the sidewalk where they had been standing, but it was empty. He was nowhere in sight. She noted the time as she cranked the truck. Might as well pick up something for him to eat before driving back out of town. Maybe after she got Zayn dressed and fed, he would leave. Then she could get Back to her normal. Chapter 14. Zayn paced the house wearing the drop cloth like a kilt as energy continued to surge through his body. Since Skylar had left, he'd shifted into Wolf twice, and he wasn't sure why. He couldn't determine what was causing him to shift or why he couldn't control it. He was trapped inside a body he could not control. He was fucking helpless like a damn infant. He slammed his fist down on the board of the kitchen island. The wood split in half and slid onto the floor. The slam of the back door had him turning and bowing up. What the hell did you do? Skylar's expression was full-on pissed off as she pointed to the wood on the floor. I got a little jumpy. He flexed his hands as he sucked in a breath. Well, why don't you try calming the hell down? I just started on this kitchen. And if you don't stop tearing stuff up, I'm never going to get finished. And when I don't finish, I don't get paid. She shoved the plastic bag into his chest. I'm not made of money like you. I actually have to work hard for what money I earn. Look, princess, I don't know what crawled up your ass, but you need to stop with the attitude. I'm not exactly feeling in control today, so you need to be careful with what you say, he growled. She spun around on her heel and shot him a glare so heated it should have fried his ass right there in the kitchen. Don't ever call me princess. She shoved her finger in his face. Let's not forget that it's you trespassing on my project. I have a feeling that the owner of this house would take an issue to having a werewolf hiding out in the shed like a common criminal. He arched a brow. The pounding of energy in his veins relented a bit. He should be angrier, but instead her tirade amused him. He grinned. Skylar, I guess some things never change. You're the same Spitfire I remember. From when you were a kid. He'd known something was familiar about the female when he'd laid eyes on her. So you do remember me. She dropped her hand and stared up at him with her mouth open. You are hard to forget, he admitted. I was an annoying kid who used to get under your skin. You and Katie both did. It was like having two sisters except one didn't always stay at the house. How is Katie? She swallowed and looked away. I haven't heard from her since I moved to Jonesboro. I wouldn't know. The anger was back in his blood and building to a slow frenzy. He tried to shove away the emotions that only his sister could arouse in him, but it wasn't working. He'd not talked to her in forever. And it was all Jaden's fault. I've left messages and tried to find her on the internet, but I can't find out anything. It's like she doesn't want me to find her. Skylar's soft voice had him jerking her head in his direction. It's not just you. She's cut her family out of her life, Zane stated. The word settled in his stomach like a sickness. They'd been so close growing up. And now they were strangers. Maybe she just needs time to spread her wings. Get out from under her big brother's shadow. She chortled. You have to admit, Zane, you were a bit overbearing when she was growing up. I was not, he thundered. She flinched at the tone, and he immediately wished he could take it back. Instead, he changed the subject. So you do remember me. After all, why didn't you say something earlier? She shrugged her slim shoulders. Her red hair slid like silk across her shoulders with the motion. He inhaled deeply, hoping he could catch her scent. But once again he couldn't smell a thing. He felt blind. I didn't figure you would recognize me. The last time you saw me I was a little girl. She walked over to the kitchen window and peered out. You've certainly changed. No longer that annoying little girl. She cast a glance over her shoulder and smirked. Now I'm an annoying woman. A laugh escaped his lips. Try on the clothes and see if they fit. He gathered the bag and stepped into the next room to dress. Are you expecting your crew to come in? He tugged on the jeans and was relieved when they fit. She guessed his size correctly. Yes, and we need to get you out before they show up. I can't do this whole job on my own. He slid the t-shirt over his head and froze. You do construction work too? She spun around and leaned back against the area where the sink would eventually go. What's wrong? Don't think I'm capable? I can do anything a man can do, and usually better. It just takes me longer because I like to do it. Right. Her blue eyes flashed. That I can believe. What's that supposed to mean? She uncrossed her arms and frowned. When you and Katie were kids and you would come over, you were always straightening up her room because you said it was too messy. You even redressed her dolls because you said their clothes didn't match. He chuckled. It felt good to remember something good from the past instead of feeling the pain of how their family was in ruins now. She grinned. I can't help it. Must be my OCD. My mom always laughed about it. He couldn't help but think it had more to do with the environment she'd been raised in. It was common knowledge that Dale Wade would never get the Father of the Year award. He was a mean old man who'd lost his mate when Skylar was born. The first time Zayn had laid eyes on Skylar had been when his sister had brought her over to play. He remembered how dirty Skylar had looked, face unwashed, dirt under her nails, and dressed in clothes that had not been washed in forever. She had been no more than 4 years old, and had been left alone to play out in front of her daddy's beat-up old trailer. His sister had spotted her when her mother had driven by on their way to the grocery store. Katie had started crying and pitching a fit until his mom had pulled over and turned around. His mom had left a note on the door and let Skylar come home to play for the afternoon. His mother, Victoria Steele, being the kindest woman he'd ever known, had been itching to get Skylar in a tub full of soap and scrub her until she was clean. But she didn't want to embarrass her, so instead she turned on the sprinklers in the front yard and put down a plastic sheet and loaded it down with liquid soap. After she gave her one of Katie's swimsuits, she encouraged them to slide. Every time one of them slid down the plastic, they would be covered with bubbles. In the meantime, she'd washed her clothes and dried them so she would have something clean to wear home. After that day, every time he saw Skylar, she was clean. He didn't know if she was bathing herself or if his mother had a hand in it. "How's your mom?" Her face softened at the mention of his mother. "She doing well. Still got my dad wrapped around her finger. They just moved down to the coast. She said she was tired of Arkansas getting so much snow. She figured there's a lot less chance of that happening there." He grinned. "Your parents were always good to me. I didn't know they had moved." Katie didn't say much about them whenever I asked. She smiled. "Richard probably loves the coast. He was always such a big fisherman." "True." He glanced down at the waistband of her jeans and nodded at her gun. "I don't think you need that around me, do you? I always carry this when I go to one of my job sites." Her expression hardened. "It seems like I'm always finding drug dealers breaking in at night to either steal my stuff or to get high." He froze. "You're not going out at night by yourself to check this out, are you?" She shrugged. "Sometimes. I already had $2,000 worth of tools stolen. I can't afford to take another hit like that, so I try to ride out to my work sites at night to make sure everything is okay. I don't do it every night, though." "You didn't last night," he stated. If she had come out to the work site last night with a gun, he would have ended up with a bullet in his hide. "No, I didn't. And imagine my surprise when I get here and see my shed had been broken into. I was expecting all my tools to be gone. Instead I get a blast from the past who happens to be a guardian." She cocked her head. Something about him being a guardian bothered her a great deal. "How did that happen anyway? I figured you would have followed in your dad's footsteps and gone to law school and then made partner at his firm." Zayn shrugged. "Not my thing." He didn't bother telling her that he'd gone to college and actually graduated from law school. He never got around to taking the bar. He had known from the start that law was his father's dream and not his. He'd spent many sleepless nights worrying about disappointing him, so when he'd finally told him, he'd been surprised by his reaction. His father hadn't been disappointed, and he'd told Zayn that all he'd ever wanted was for him to find what made him happy and to pursue that. Being a guardian was Zayn's calling. When Barrett Middleton had offered him the job, he'd taken the opportunity and had never looked back. Now that opportunity might be taken from him if he didn't figure out what the hell was wrong with him. He frowned as he studied Skylar. "So there are a lot of drugs in town? Do you know what kind of drugs they're doing?" "Cocaine, heroin, crystal meth. It's skyrocketed over the last few weeks." She shook her head. "And it's werewolves who are selling it to humans. I overheard a couple of wars trying to sell it to one of my Hispanic construction workers. Thankfully he declined. I try to make sure everyone I hire is clean." She looked at him. "It's weird. Usually drug dealers are users too. But not these wars. They don't mind selling it, but they sure as hell aren't touching the stuff themselves." Zayn's blood ran cold. "How do you know?" "After my worker declined their sale, I walked over to them and took the drug out of the asshole's hand. I opened the bag it was in and started dumping it out on the ground. The guy jumped back. like he didn't want the stuff getting on him. It was weird. He grabbed her arms and glared down at her. Did he say why he didn't want to touch it? Did he say what was in it? Did he say what they had added to it? Let go of me. She shook off his hold and stepped out of his reach. His pulse jackhammered in his head as anger once again began to flood his cells. He didn't say anything, just acted weird. She cocked her head. Zayn, why are you so interested in this? It's my job as a guardian. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to control his sudden rage. No. What? He jerked his head up at her. The way you're acting is making me think otherwise. This seems very personal. To you. She narrowed her eyes and took another step away from him. Her hand rested on the butt of her gun. You're not on this stuff, are you? What? His eyes widened as his heart sped up. Adrenaline pumped through his body at an alarming rate, signaling his impending shift. He turned away from her and grabbed the counter, trying to hold the shift at bay. Skylar, you need to leave. Zayn, what's wrong? He heard the tremble in her voice and sensed her fear. He knew he wasn't going to be able to control himself once he shifted. Skylar, leave. Now. He growled as his body began the transformation. His bones lengthened and his tendons stretched to accommodate his wolf body. Fur sprouted across his flesh until he was covered in a furry pelt. He glanced down at the floor through his wolf eyes. Fuck. He'd ruined his clothes. Again. Why did you shift? She spun around to the back door and peered out the window. Is there danger? She glanced at him over her shoulder. Anger and agitation flooded his body at an alarming rate. He glared at Skylar and wanted nothing more than to attack. What the hell was wrong with him? Why did he want to attack Skylar? She done nothing wrong. Zayn. His eyes popped open at the soft sound of her voice. Her beautiful eyes were wide with concern. The sound of her breathing increased and his pupils dilated. His gaze drifted down her curvy form as agitation quickly turned to lust. Run. He wanted to scream to warn her away from him, but he couldn't speak. He glanced down, holding himself back from launching at her and tackling her. He could see the scene in his head. Damn, he wanted her bad. Lifting his head to the ceiling, he let out a howl as he lost his battle with his own body. Chapter 15. Skylar reached for the gun as Zayn's howl echoed in the house. In wolf form, he had to be at least twice the size he was in human form. Every powerful muscle in his body twitched as if he were holding himself back from something. His body trembled as his eyes popped open and he narrowed his gaze on her. Gone was the boy she'd grown up with. A killer's eyes stared back at her instead. She aimed the weapon at the large wolf. Her gut clenched as her finger trembled against the trigger. Did she have it in her to put a bullet in her best friend's brother? Zayn, I know you're in there. She swallowed the lump that had formed in the back of her throat. I'm not sure what's going on, but you need to shift back. His muscles tensed for a brief second. He turned to his left and then walked back to his right. She watched him for several seconds as he paced in the small kitchen. It's broad daylight. Someone might drop by and see you. You know it's against the rules for humans to see us. She gritted her teeth and lowered the gun. If he were going to attack, he would have done so by now. She frowned as she watched him. Zayn, what's going on? He continued to pace the small room, his large body bumping into the corner of the lower kitchen cabinets. Shift back so we can talk about this. He stopped for a second and then glanced down at the floor. He lifted his head and met her gaze. He made his way to the corner of the room and paced around in a circle before lying down and curling up into a ball. Her heart sunk in her chest as reality settled over her in a sickening wave. You can't shift back, can you? Chapter 16. Zayn stared up at Skylar as he tried to control the rush of adrenaline flooding his veins. Maybe if he could just relax enough, he could shift back. If he couldn't get this under control, then he was going to be screwed. Zayn. She stepped forward and cast a worried look at him. He lifted his head and sniffed the air. He still couldn't smell her scent. His gut sunk like a rock. Look, I've got my crew showing up soon, so we need to get you out of here. She squatted beside him and cocked her head. One of them is a werewolf, and if he sees you in wolf form, he will contact the Packmaster. And you don't want that, do you? Shifting in broad daylight was against the code. It was punishable by death, because it put the entire species at risk. there was a standing reward for turning in any werewolf who broke the rule. He bet his ass that he'd get turned in for the money. Skylar glanced at her phone and then back at him. I can take you back to my place and let you stay there. But we need to leave now before anyone arrives. He looked up at her, wondering how he of all people had managed to get his ass into this position. He had no other option but to do what she said. It wasn't ideal, but he knew what would happen if he stayed. She stood and glanced out the window. He had a bad feeling that her house wasn't exactly isolated out in the country. He definitely didn't need to be in town. The chance of exposure was too great, but right now he was out of options. I live in an apartment. She gave him a grimace of a smile. Things had gone from bad to fucked up in 0.8 seconds,